Everyone thought the inheritance was just an old house. But when Audrey Callahan broke through the wall that had been sealed for over a century, she discovered something that would force her to call the police, unravel a conspiracy spanning generations, and confront the ghosts of a family she never knew existed. What she found inside would rewrite everything she believed about mercy, sacrifice, and the weight of blood. The Ford Focus sputtered to a stop outside the First National Bank of Portland, its engine coughing twice before falling silent. Audrey sat gripping the steering wheel, staring at the rejection letter in her lap. Loan application denied. Insufficient credit history. Outstanding debts exceeding collateral. The words blurred together, each one a small knife cutting away what remained of her dignity. Her phone vibrated against the passenger seat. Derek's lawyer. Again. She didn't need to read the message to know what it said. $12,000 in back child support for Lily, her granddaughter, the 10-year-old caught in the crossfire of her son's deployment to Afghanistan, and a system that measured worth in dollars rather than effort. The eviction notice folded beneath the rejection letter gave her 30 days. 30 days to find somewhere to go. With a credit score destroyed by a man who had taken everything in the divorce and left her with half a teaching pension and a mountain of his hidden debts. March rain drummed against the windshield, turning the street into a watercolor of grays. Audrey pressed her forehead to the steering wheel and allowed herself 10 seconds of surrender. 10 seconds to feel the full weight of 52 years collapsing into this single moment of absolute failure. Then she sat up, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and reached for the envelope that had been sitting unopened on the dashboard for 3 days. Whitman and Associates, attorneys at law. The return address was embossed. Expensive. She slid her finger under the flap and pulled out a single sheet of heavy cream paper. Dear Ms. Callahan, we regret to inform you of the passing of Harold James Callahan on February 28. As his sole surviving relative, you are named beneficiary of his estate, specifically the property located at 447 Mercy Road, Portland, Maine. The attached deed transfers ownership contingent upon your occupancy of the residence for a minimum of 180 consecutive days. The property may not be sold, transferred, or demolished prior to December 31st, 2025. Please contact our office to schedule a viewing and finalize the transfer. Audrey read it 3 times. Harold Callahan. Her father's older brother. The uncle she had met exactly twice in her life, once at her father's funeral when she was 12, and once at her grandmother's wake when she was 17. A man who had smiled sadly at her both times, pressed a $20 bill into her hand, and vanished back into whatever silent life he led. She had not known he was still alive. She had not known he owned property. She had not known he remembered her name. 180 days. 6 months. The eviction notice gave her 30. The math was simple, brutal, and possibly the only piece of mercy the universe had offered her in the past year. She started the car and drove to the address printed at the bottom of the letter. The law office occupied the 2nd floor of a brick building on Congress Street, the kind of place where money whispered rather than shouted. Audrey climbed the stairs in jeans and a coat that had seen better winters, aware of how out of place she looked among the polished wood and leather furniture. A receptionist with silver hair and perfect posture glanced up, took in Audrey's appearance, and offered a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Before she could speak, the elevator doors opened and a man stepped out. Tall, mid-50s, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Audrey's monthly rent. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who had never been denied a loan, never waited on hold with a creditor, never felt the particular shame of counting coins to buy milk. His eyes swept over Audrey and dismissed her in the same motion. The receptionist stood. "Mr. Harlow, Your 3 o'clock is ready in conference room B. Harlow. The name caught in Audrey's memory, something her father had mentioned once, though she couldn't place it. The man nodded and turned toward the hallway, then paused as the receptionist added, "Miss Callahan is here regarding the Mercy Road property." The man turned back, and something flickered across his face. Recognition? Or perhaps irritation. He studied Audrey with new interest, his gaze sharp and calculating. 447 Mercy Road. Harold's death trap. Audrey straightened. "I'm sorry?" Harlow smiled, but it held no warmth. "I made your uncle 4 offers over the past 10 years. He refused every one. Said he'd rather see the place burn than sell it to me. His words, not mine. I assume you're more practical. I haven't seen the property yet. Then allow me to save you the trouble. It's a 100-year-old Victorian that should have been condemned 2 decades ago. The foundation is compromised. The electrical system is a fire hazard, and the last inspection report recommended immediate demolition. I'm prepared to offer you $200,000 cash for the land. You can close within a week and walk away with enough to start over somewhere that isn't actively falling down around you." The dismissal in his voice, the assumption that she would leap at the offer, sparked something cold and stubborn in Audrey's chest. She met his eyes and kept her voice level. "I'll let you know after I see it." Harlow's smile tightened. "The offer expires in 7 days. After that, I'll pursue other options." He nodded to the receptionist and disappeared down the hallway. Audrey stood in the silence that followed, her hands trembling slightly. Other options. It sounded like a threat, though she couldn't imagine what leverage a stranger could possibly have over an inheritance she had received by accident. The receptionist cleared her throat. "Mr. Whitman is ready for you, Miss Callahan." The lawyer was 70 if he was a day, with kind eyes and hands that shook slightly as he poured her tea she hadn't asked for. He explained the terms of the inheritance again, slower this time, as if he suspected she hadn't understood the letter. The house was hers if she lived in it for 6 months, no loopholes, no exceptions. Harold had been very specific. "Did he say why?" Audrey asked. Whitman hesitated, then reached into a drawer and withdrew a small metal lockbox, the kind used for important documents. He set it on the desk between them. "Your uncle left this with instructions that it only be opened after you had resided in the house for 30 days. He was quite adamant about the timing." "What's in it?" "I don't know. He sealed it himself." Whitman paused, choosing his words carefully. Harold was a private man. Troubled, some might say. He spent the last 30 years of his life in that house, barely leaving, rarely speaking to anyone. When he came to update his will 6 months ago, he seemed burdened. He said the house had a story that needed to be told, but only by someone who earned the right to tell it. Audrey stared at the box. It was perhaps 8 inches long, 4 wide, made of brushed steel with a combination lock that had been taped over. "Do I have a choice? About the 180 days?" Whitman's expression softened. "Legally, yes. You can refuse the inheritance and walk away. The property would revert to the state, likely be auctioned for back taxes. But Miss Callahan, speaking as someone who knew your uncle for 40 years, he chose you for a reason. He had no obligation to leave you anything. The fact that he did, with these specific conditions, suggests he believed you were capable of something he was not." "And what was that?" Whitman shook his head slowly. "I suspect that's what you'll find out if you stay." Audrey took the box, signed the papers, and drove to Mercy Road with the locked secret sitting cold and heavy in her lap. The house waited at the end of a long graveled drive, set back from the street by a stand of skeletal elms that had not yet budged toward spring. Victorian in the way of old New England, tall, narrow, with a peaked roof and wraparound porch that sagged under its own weight. The paint had peeled away in long curls, exposing wood gone gray with age. Several windows were cracked or missing entirely, covered with plywood that had warped and split. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, and on the gate hung a red sign. Condemned. Portland City Authority. No trespassing. Audrey sat in the car and stared. This was mercy. This was all that stood between her and the street. The passenger door opened, and Ruth Callahan, Audrey's mother, lowered herself into the seat with a grunt. She was 72, bird-thin, with hands that trembled from the heart medication she could barely afford. She had been waiting at the corner as arranged, a small suitcase at her feet containing everything she owned that mattered. Well, Ruth's voice was dry. Harold always did have a flair for the dramatic. From the back seat came a small voice, bright with the kind of honesty only children possess. It looks haunted. Lily Callahan was 10 years old, all elbows and dark curls, her father's eyes in a face that would someday be beautiful, but was currently just young and uncertain. Her mother had disappeared 3 years ago, leaving Lily's father, Audrey's son, to raise her alone until his National Guard unit deployed to Kabul. Now Lily spent weekdays with Derek's parents and weekends with Audrey, caught between adults who measured her worth in custody agreements and support payments. Audrey turned in her seat. "Do you want to see inside?" Lily pressed her nose to the window. "Do ghosts pay rent?" "Not in my experience." "Then I guess we don't have a choice." They got out of the car and approached the gate. The condemned sign was dated 18 months prior, but someone had written across it in black marker, "Legally contested, H.J. Callahan." Audrey pushed the gate open, and it shrieked on rusted hinges, a sound like something dying. The porch steps groaned under their weight, but held. The front door was locked, but Whitman had given Audrey a key ring holding 7 different keys, each one labeled in spidery handwriting. She tried 3 before finding the one marked "Main Entrance." The door swung inward, and the house exhaled, a breath of stale air and old wood and something else, something metallic and cold that made Audrey's skin prickle. The hallway stretched before them into shadow, the afternoon light barely penetrating the filthy windows. Dust lay thick on every surface, undisturbed by footsteps or wind. To the left, a staircase climbed toward darkness. To the right, a doorway opened into what might have been a parlor. Lily stepped inside, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "Grandma, why would Uncle Harold live here?" "Because sometimes people carry weight they don't know how to put down." Ruth moved past them, her hand trailing along the wall. "My father-in-law lived here when I married Audrey's father. That was 1956. It was beautiful then. He built furniture in the basement workshop, sold it at the market on Saturdays. But after he died, Harold moved in, and everything just stopped." "What stopped?" Audrey asked. Ruth paused at the parlor doorway, looking at something Audrey couldn't see. The light. The life. Harold shut himself away from the world like he was hiding from something, or guarding it. They moved through the first floor in silence, cataloging the damage. Water stains on the ceiling, cracked plaster, floorboards that had rotted through in places. The kitchen still held remnants of Harold's final days. A teacup in the sink, a newspaper dated February 26th, a calendar on the wall with nothing marked beyond that month. In the pantry, Lily found a small stack of leather-bound notebooks, their pages filled with cramped handwriting that was impossible to read in the dim light. Audrey took one and carried it to the window. The first page was dated March 1903, a journal, Not Harold's, but someone else's. Someone who had lived here over a century ago. She flipped through carefully, seeing entries about weather, crop prices, the names of people long dead. Then, near the middle, a page that made her stop. The network is compromised. They know about the harbor routes. I must move everyone by week's end or risk losing them all. She showed it to Ruth, who read it twice, and then closed the journal with shaking hands. We need to see the basement. The door to the cellar was in the kitchen, hidden behind a pantry shelf that swung outward on well-oiled hinges. Beyond it, wooden steps descended into absolute darkness. Audrey found a flashlight in a drawer, its batteries barely clinging to life, and led the way down. The basement was larger than she expected, running the full length of the house. Support pillars rose like trees in a dead forest. Cobwebs hung in sheets. The air was thick and cold, tasting of earth and rust. But what seized Audrey's attention was the wall at the eastern end. A section of brickwork that was clearly newer than the rest, built from different materials in a different pattern. The bricks were dark red, almost black, and between them the mortar had been mixed with something that glittered in the flashlight beam. Lily walked up to it and placed her small hand flat against the surface. It's warm. Ruth stepped closer, then reached out and knocked 3 times. The sound that came back was hollow, deep. There's space behind this. Audrey moved to examine the edges where the new wall met the old foundation. Whoever had built this had done so quickly but carefully, sealing it completely. There were no gaps, no obvious weak points. And at the base, half hidden in shadow, someone had scratched words into the mortar before it dried. Do not open until 2024. That's this year. Lily's voice was very small. Why this year? Audrey didn't answer because she had no answer to give. She ran the flashlight along the wall's perimeter and found something else. At shoulder height, a small depression in the mortar where something had been pressed and removed. The shape was rectangular, about the size of a key. They climbed back upstairs, and Audrey went through Harold's key ring again. Most were standard house keys, but one was different. Old brass, ornate, with a shaft that ended in a complex pattern of teeth. The tag read simply, East, 1906. The house settled around them with sounds like breathing. Somewhere above, a shutter banged against siding. Lily had gone quiet, pressed against Ruth's side. Her earlier bravado faded. Audrey looked at her mother. What do you think is behind that wall? Ruth's face had gone pale in the dim light. When your grandfather died, Harold told me something at the funeral. He said this house was built on secrets, and that some secrets were meant to stay buried until the people who needed them dead were gone. I thought he was talking nonsense. Grief makes people say strange things. But now, she didn't finish. She didn't need to. They spent the next hour making the house barely habitable. Audrey found the main water valve and discovered that Harold had kept the utilities on, paying from some account that must have survived him. The water ran rust brown for 5 minutes before clearing. The electricity worked in some rooms, but not others. Upstairs, they chose the 3 cleanest bedrooms and swept out the worst of the dust and debris. Ruth insisted on the smallest room, leaving Audrey the master bedroom, and Lily a corner room with windows facing the overgrown garden. By nightfall, they had inflatable mattresses set up and a space heater running in the hallway. Audrey heated canned soup on the gas stove while Lily explored with a flashlight, and Ruth sat in the parlor, staring at nothing. When they sat down to eat, Lily spoke around a mouthful of crackers. Are we really going to stay here 6 months? We don't have anywhere else to go, sweetheart. What about the man who wanted to buy it? Couldn't we sell it to him and get an apartment? Audrey thought about Harlow's smile, the casual cruelty in his assumption that she was desperate enough to accept any offer. We could, but this house belonged to our family. Your great-great-uncle lived here, your great-grandfather before that. Maybe there's a reason we were supposed to come back. Or maybe Uncle Harold was just crazy and we're going to die of mold poisoning. Lily said it matter-of-factly, without fear, and Audrey couldn't help but smile. Also a possibility. They cleaned up in silence and prepared for bed. Audrey checked the locks on all the doors twice, though she wasn't sure what she was locking out or in. Upstairs, she tucked Lily into a sleeping bag on top of the air mattress and sat on the edge until the girl's breathing evened into sleep. In her own room, Audrey lay awake listening to the house. It was full of sound. Settling beams, wind through cracks, the scurry of small animals in the walls. But beneath it all was something else, something rhythmic and patient, like a heartbeat heard through water. At 2:30 in the morning, the knocking began. 3 sharp raps, a pause, 2 more, then silence. Then the pattern repeated. Audrey sat up, her own heart hammering. The sound was coming from downstairs, from the direction of the kitchen. She grabbed the flashlight and her phone, hesitated, then crept into the hallway. Ruth's door was closed, her mother's breathing audible through it, still asleep. Lily's door was cracked open, and Audrey checked to find her granddaughter sprawled across the mattress, one arm flung out, deeply unconscious. The knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. Audrey descended the stairs slowly, each step a small act of courage. The main floor was colder than it had been, her breath visible in the beam of her flashlight. She moved through the parlor into the kitchen and stopped at the top of the basement stairs. The sound was definitely coming from below, from the sealed wall. She should call the police. She should wake Ruth. She should do anything except what she was doing, which was walking down those stairs toward a sound that should not exist. But something pulled her forward. Not courage, not curiosity, but a strange sense of obligation, as if ignoring the knocking would be a betrayal of something she didn't yet understand. The basement was exactly as they had left it, except now the darkness seemed thicker, more present. Audrey crossed to the eastern wall and stood before it, the flashlight shaking in her hand. The knocking came from directly in front of her. 3 raps. Pause. 2 raps. She placed her palm against the brick and felt the vibration travel through her bones. The wall was warm, just as Lily had said. Impossibly warm, as if something living waited on the other side. Then, so faint she almost missed it, a sound that stopped her breath. A voice, muffled by stone and a century of silence, speaking words she couldn't quite make out, but that sounded desperately, unbearably human. Audrey stood in the dark and understood that whatever her uncle had been guarding, whatever secret this house held, she had just become its keeper. Upstairs, the first light of dawn began to creep through broken windows. March 20th, day 1 of 180. The knocking stopped, and in the silence that followed, Audrey Callahan made a choice that would unravel everything. She would open the wall. But not yet. Not until she understood what she was releasing. She climbed back upstairs as the house settled into morning, carried the locked metal box to the kitchen table, and sat staring at it until Ruth found her there an hour later, cold tea untouched, eyes fixed on a secret she wasn't yet allowed to know. The days that followed established a rhythm born of necessity. Audrey woke before dawn to survey the damage and prioritize repairs. The roof leaked in 3 places. The bathroom plumbing groaned but functioned. The furnace was dead, but the gas stove worked, and space heaters kept the chill at bay. She made lists, calculated costs, and watched her meager savings evaporate with each trip to the hardware store. Lily started school at Portland Elementary, a half-hour bus ride that left her exhausted and quiet. Ruth took her medications with tea that had gone cold, staring out windows at a garden that had become a wilderness. And at night, after they had all retreated to their rooms, Audrey descended to the basement and stood before the wall, listening. The knocking came irregularly now. Sometimes 3 nights would pass in silence. Then it would return. The same pattern, 3 and 2, like a heartbeat struggling to maintain rhythm. Audrey began to recognize other sounds as well. A scraping, as if something moved against stone. A long exhale that might have been wind through a crack or might have been breath. And once, just once, a word that sounded like, please. On the 6th day, she took the blueprint Lily had found and spread it across the kitchen table. The house's original plans, drawn in 1898 by someone with precise, elegant handwriting. Thomas Callahan, architect, was written in the lower corner. Her great-great-grandfather. A man she knew nothing about, except that he had built this house and apparently designed it with spaces that didn't appear in the final structure. The basement on the blueprint showed an open floor plan with support pillars and a workshop area. No wall, no sealed chamber. But in the margins, written in faded red ink, were notes. Ventilation system, minimum 48 hours air supply. False wall construction, human concealment. Emergency exit, tunnel to secondary location. Human concealment. The words sat heavy in her mind. Ruth came to stand beside her, reading over her shoulder. Your great-great-grandfather was helping people hide. From what? From whoever wanted them found. Audrey thought about the journal entries she had read, the references to networks and routes and people who needed to disappear. Portland in the early 1900s had been a harbor city, a waypoint for immigrants and laborers. She had read about labor trafficking, about men and women lured to America with promises of work and trapped in conditions that amounted to slavery. If Thomas Callahan had been helping them escape, then someone would have wanted to stop him. Ruth finished the thought. The 7th day brought the first real snow of late March, wet and heavy. Audrey was in the basement, examining the wall with a level she had borrowed from a neighbor, when she heard footsteps above. Lily appeared at the top of the stairs, still in her school backpack. Grandma, there's a man at the door. Audrey climbed up to find Garrett Sullivan standing on the porch. 68 years old, weathered face, carpenter's hands, and eyes that held a knowledge he seemed reluctant to share. He lived in the house next door, a tidy ranch with a workshop visible through the side windows. Miss Callahan. He had the careful pronunciation of someone who had spent years speaking precisely. I'm Garrett Sullivan, your neighbor. He held out a covered dish. My wife passed 5 years back, but she taught me to cook. Thought you might appreciate a warm meal while you're settling in. Audrey took the dish, surprised by the gesture. That's very kind. Garrett looked past her into the house, and something flickered across his face, recognition mixed with an emotion she couldn't name. Harold was a good man. Quiet, but good. We had an understanding. What kind of understanding? He paid me $200 a month for 15 years to watch this place. Make sure no one broke in. Make sure certain people stayed away. His eyes found hers. I never knew why until now. Audrey stepped aside. Would you like to come in? Garrett hesitated, then nodded and crossed the threshold like a man entering a church, respectful, almost reverent. He walked through the first floor slowly, his fingers trailing along the walls, pausing at doorways. In the kitchen, he stopped before the basement door. You've been down there. It wasn't a question. Yes, and you found the wall. Audrey felt something cold settle in her stomach. You know about it? Garrett pulled out a chair and sat heavily. What I know are fragments. Stories my father told me before he died. He worked for Thomas Callahan, your great-great-grandfather, from 1901 until Thomas was killed in April of 1906. My father was 16 years old, an apprentice carpenter. He helped build that wall. Why? Garrett's hands trembled slightly as he folded them on the table. Because Thomas asked him to seal a room that held something too dangerous to destroy, but too important to leave accessible. My father said Thomas told him the wall couldn't be opened until everyone who knew what was inside had passed, that the truth would be safe in darkness until the world was ready to hear it. What truth? I don't know. My father went to his grave without telling me, but he made me promise that if anyone from the Callahan family ever came back to this house, I would tell them 3 things. Garrett met her eyes. First, don't open the wall alone. Second, whatever you find behind it belonged to people who had no other place to put their hope. And third, there are families in Portland who have spent 100 years making sure that wall stays sealed, and they won't be happy when you break it open. Who? He didn't give me names, but he said to watch for anyone who asks too many questions about the house or offers to buy it for more than it's worth. He said they'll smile and call it development or progress, but what they're really buying is silence. Reginald Harlow, Audrey said quietly. Garrett's expression hardened. His great-great-grandfather, Samuel Harlow, was a powerful man in Portland at the turn of the century, owned the rail yards, had contracts with the shipping companies, and according to my father, he was the reason Thomas Callahan died. They sat in silence while snow tapped against the windows. Finally, Audrey spoke. There's something alive behind that wall. Or there was. I hear it at night. Not alive. Garrett's voice was gentle, but not quite dead either. Some things echo long after they should have faded. This house has been listening for someone brave enough to answer. Looks like it chose you. After Garrett left, Audrey stood in the kitchen and felt the weight of inheritance settle more heavily than before. She was not brave. She was desperate, exhausted, running from debts and divorce and a life that had collapsed around her. But this house, this impossible, crumbling house, held something that people had died to protect and other people had killed to hide. The metal box Harold had left sat on the counter. 23 more days before she could open it. 23 more days of knocking in the dark and secrets pressing against sealed brick. That night, she didn't go to the basement. Instead, she sat with Ruth and Lily in the parlor, a space heater glowing orange between them, and told them what Garrett had said. Lily listened with the absolute focus children bring to stories that might be true. When Audrey finished, the girl asked, "If we open the wall and find something bad, can we close it again?" "I don't know, sweetheart. But if we don't open it, we'll never know what Uncle Harold wanted us to find." Ruth reached over and squeezed Lily's hand. Sometimes the bravest thing is not knowing and choosing to find out anyway. Is that what Grandma's doing? Being brave? Ruth looked at Audrey with eyes that had seen her daughter through divorce and debt and every small humiliation the past year had offered. "I think your grandmother has been brave every day of her life. This is just the first time the universe has given her a chance to be brave about something that matters." Audrey's throat tightened with emotion she couldn't name, but she kept her composure. She had cried enough. What she needed now was not courage, but clarity. A plan, a path forward, some sense of what opening that wall might unleash. The answer came 4 days later, delivered by a man Audrey had hoped never to see again. Reginald Harlow appeared on a Thursday afternoon, stepping out of a black Mercedes with the easy confidence of someone who owned the world and was willing to rent it back to you at interest. He wore a cashmere coat against the cold and shoes that had never touched mud. Audrey watched from the kitchen window as he approached, and something in his walk, the assumption of welcome, made her angry in a way she hadn't felt in months. She met him at the door before he could knock. "Mr. Harlow." He smiled, all warmth and practiced charm. "Miss Callahan, I was hoping we could talk." "You made your offer. I declined." "That was before you'd seen the property. Now that you've lived here a few days, I thought you might have reconsidered." He glanced past her into the house. "May I come in?" "No." The smile tightened, but held. "I'm prepared to increase my offer. $250,000, cash, closing within a week. That's more than fair for a house that should have been condemned." "If it should have been condemned, why do you want it?" Harlow's eyes went cold. "Land value, Miss Callahan. This property sits on one of the last undeveloped parcels with harbor views. I could build something beautiful here, something that serves the community. The way your great-great-grandfather served the community." The charm evaporated. "I don't know what lies you've been told, but my family built this city. We employed thousands, created opportunities, brought prosperity to Portland when it was barely more than a fishing village. By trafficking laborers who thought they were coming to freedom." Harlow took a step closer, and Audrey resisted the urge to step back. "You need to be very careful about making accusations you can't prove. Slander is a serious offense. So is murder." His face went perfectly still. "Who told you that?" "I've been reading. Old journals. Family records. It's amazing what you can find in a house this old." It was a lie, but it landed. She saw it in the way his jaw clenched. The flicker of something that might have been fear before he buried it beneath anger. "This house has made people crazy before. Harold spent 30 years here and died a broken man, talking to walls and seeing ghosts. If you're smart, you'll take my offer and walk away before it does the same to you." "I'll take my chances." Harlow produced a business card and set it on the porch railing. "When you change your mind, and you will, call that number. But don't wait too long. My patience has limits." He returned to his car and drove away without looking back. Audrey stood on the porch until the Mercedes disappeared, then picked up the card. On the back, handwritten in neat script, "Some walls were built to stay closed. Opening them makes you responsible for whatever comes out." She carried it inside and added it to the growing pile of warnings. That night, the knocking was different. Not the steady pattern she had come to recognize, but frantic, desperate, like fists against stone. Audrey descended to the basement and stood before the wall, her hand pressed flat against brick that was no longer warm, but burning hot. The voice came again, clearer this time. "Please, oh God, please." She spoke to the darkness, her voice shaking. "Who are you?" The knocking stopped. Silence pressed in, so complete that Audrey could hear her own heartbeat. Then, faint as breath, a single word. "Jonathan." Audrey's legs nearly gave out. She sat hard on the concrete floor, the flashlight rolling away from her and casting wild shadows across the ceiling. Jonathan. A name, a person. Someone who had been sealed behind this wall for over a century, waiting for someone to hear them. Not alive, Garrett's words echoed, but not quite dead either. She didn't know how long she sat there. But when she finally climbed the stairs, dawn was touching the windows, and her decision was made. On the 28th day of March, with Ruth and Lily watching from the top of the stairs, Audrey descended to the basement, carrying a sledgehammer borrowed from Garrett Sullivan. She had waited 8 days. She couldn't wait any longer. The wall waited for her, dark and silent. She swung the hammer. The first blow sent cracks, spiderwebbing across the mortar. The second dislodged a brick that fell with a hollow thud. The third opened a gap large enough to release a gust of air so cold and dry it burned her lungs. Lily's voice floated down. "What do you see?" "Nothing yet," Audrey called back, though that wasn't quite true. Through the gap, she could see deeper darkness, and within it, a shape that might have been furniture, or might have been something else entirely. She widened the hole brick by brick, mortar dust coating her hair and face. 30 minutes became an hour, became 2. Her arms screamed with fatigue, but she didn't stop, driven by something beyond curiosity now, a need to finish what someone had started, to free what had been trapped. When the gap was large enough, she stepped through. The room beyond was perhaps 12 feet by 15, low-ceilinged, with walls of the same dark brick. A small wooden table sat against the far wall, and on it, Audrey's scream brought Ruth and Lily running, despite her warnings to stay upstairs. But by the time they reached her, she had steadied herself enough to hold up a hand. "Don't come in. Call the police." Because on the floor beneath the table, still wearing the rotted remains of clothes from another century, sat a skeleton. Its hand rested on a leather notebook, fingers curved as if the last act of life had been to write, and on the wall above, scratched into the brick with what must have been desperate determination, were words that had waited over 100 years to be read. Thomas tried. They found us. April 3, 1906. J.W. Audrey stood in the dim light of the basement, staring at proof that some secrets don't die. They wait. The police arrived within 20 minutes, 2 patrol cars and an unmarked sedan that deposited a detective whose eyes went wide the moment he descended into the basement. Isaiah Grant was 45, with the controlled movements of someone who had learned not to waste energy, and a face that revealed nothing until he saw the skeleton. Then he went very still, staring at the remains with an expression Audrey couldn't read. "How long have you lived here?" 9 days. "And you just decided to knock down a century-old wall?" "I heard something behind it." Audrey's voice was steady despite the trembling in her hands. Knocking. A voice. "I thought someone might be trapped." Isaiah knelt beside the skeleton, careful not to disturb anything, and pulled out his phone to photograph the scene. The forensics team would need hours, maybe days, but his attention fixed on the notebook still gripped in the dead man's hand, and when he finally looked up at Audrey, something in his expression had changed. "My great-great-grandfather disappeared in April 1906. Family story says he abandoned my great-great-grandmother Mary and their newborn son. Left them with nothing. His name was Jonathan Webb. The initials on the wall," Audrey said quietly. "J.W." Isaiah stood and walked to where the words were carved. "Thomas tried. They found us." He turned back to her. "Who was Thomas?" "Thomas Callahan, my great-great-grandfather. He built this house." They stood in the dusty silence while footsteps overhead signaled the arrival of more officers. Isaiah pulled out a small notebook and began writing, his movements precise and controlled. But Audrey saw the tension in his shoulders, the weight of a family mystery that had just become a crime scene. The forensics team arrived and Isaiah cleared the basement, ushering Audrey, Ruth, and Lily upstairs, while technicians in white suits descended with equipment and cameras. The house filled with the controlled chaos of investigation. Voices calling measurements, the flash of photography, the scrape of tools against brick. Audrey sat in the kitchen with her mother and granddaughter, drinking coffee that had gone cold, waiting for permission to return to a space that was supposed to be theirs. An older woman emerged from the basement carrying evidence bags, her badge identifying her as the medical examiner. She stopped when she saw Audrey. The remains are approximately 115 to 120 years old. Male, aged 25 to 30. Cause of death appears to be dehydration and starvation. No signs of trauma. She paused. Whoever this was, they were sealed in alive and left to die. Ruth made a small sound and Lily pressed closer to her grandmother's side. Audrey felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. Why would someone do that? The examiner glanced at Isaiah, who had followed her upstairs. That's what we need to figure out. Over the next 3 hours, they removed 47 tin boxes from the sealed room, each one cataloged and photographed before being loaded into evidence containers. Isaiah allowed Audrey to watch from the basement stairs as they worked, and she saw that each box was labeled with numbers, Box 1 through Box 47, written in the same elegant script as the blueprint. When they finally opened the first box, Isaiah called her down. Inside were pages and pages of names, handwritten in columns with dates beside them. Bridget O'Connor, age 19, Cork, Ireland. Arrived March 14, 1904. Departed March 22, 1904. Destination coded as Harbor 7. Giuseppe Romano, age 14, Sicily. Arrived September 2nd, 1903. Departed September 8th, 1903. Destination, Factory Road. Anna Kowalska, age 8, Poland. Arrived December 1st, 1902. Departed December 6th, 1902. Destination, Safe House 3. There were 237 names in the first 40 boxes, each one documented with the same meticulous care. And beside 19 of them, a red mark and the word, intercepted. Isaiah's hands shook as he turned the pages. This is an underground railroad, not for escaped slaves, but for immigrants who were being trafficked. Box 41 contained a ledger showing expenditures, money Thomas Callahan had spent over 5 years. $47,000 in 1906 currency, the equivalent of over $1.5 million today. Food, clothes, bribes, transportation. Every penny accounted for. Boxes 42 through 45 held maps. Detailed drawings of safe houses along the Maine coast, each one marked with dates and capacity. 12 houses in total, from Portland to the Canadian border. Box 46 made Isaiah stop breathing. Inside was a single sheet of paper titled, The Betrayers, with 8 names written in capitals. Samuel Harlow, William Kane, Robert Morrison, Charles Blackwell, Henry Ashton, David Crane, Patrick Fletcher, Michael Brennan. Below the names, in Thomas Callahan's handwriting, these men sold human lives for profit. They intercepted refugees I was helping to freedom and returned them to forced labor or killed them when they proved difficult. I have documented their crimes. This evidence must survive, even if I do not. Isaiah photographed the page from multiple angles, his jaw clenched tight. Samuel Harlow. Jesus Christ. You know that name? Audrey said. His great-great-grandson Reginald Harlow owns half the development companies in Portland. Isaiah looked at her. Did he contact you about this house? He offered me $250,000 to sell it without even seeing inside. Isaiah pulled out his phone and stepped away to make a call. Audrey heard fragments. Need a warrant? Yes, I'm sure. Get someone from the DA's office down here now. Box 47 was the smallest, containing only a single letter written on paper so fragile the forensics tech handled it with gloves. Isaiah read it aloud, his voice barely steady. John, they're coming tonight. I seal you until I lead them away. Ledger in box 46 has everything. Get to Federal Marshal Peters, Boston. Return April 5th with help. Trust me, brother. TC, April 2nd, 1906. The room fell silent. Jonathan Webb had trusted Thomas Callahan to return, had waited in darkness for help that never came, had died alone, surrounded by the evidence of the network he'd helped run, unable to deliver it to anyone who could make it matter. Lily's small voice broke the quiet from where she stood at the top of the stairs. Why didn't Thomas come back? Because someone killed him first, Isaiah said. The investigation consumed the rest of the day. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, asking if anyone remembered Harold Callahan or knew about the sealed room. Garrett Sullivan gave a statement confirming what his father had told him. The medical examiner estimated Jonathan Webb had survived perhaps 6 to 8 days after being sealed in, based on the deterioration patterns and the final entries in his notebook, which they carefully extracted and preserved. Isaiah read those entries to Audrey in the kitchen while the house emptied of police personnel. Jonathan's handwriting had started neat and precise, recording everything Thomas had told him to document. By day 4, it had become shaky. By day 6, barely legible. The final entry, dated April 9th, 1906, consisted of 3 lines. No water left. Can hear them searching outside. Tell Mary I loved her. Tell Thomas I forgive him. Audrey pressed her hands flat against the table to keep them from shaking. What happened to Thomas? Official records say he drowned in the harbor on April 15th, 1906. Body recovered 3 days later. Death ruled accidental. Isaiah's expression was grim. But my great-great-grandmother told her children that men came to the house looking for Jonathan a week after he vanished. Said they tore the place apart and threatened her. She took her baby and disappeared. Changed her name. Started over in Boston. She never knew what happened to her husband. Until now. Until now. Isaiah closed his notebook and looked at Audrey with an intensity that made her straighten. I'm going to need you to be very careful. The families whose names are in that box, the Harlows, the Canes, the Morrisons, they're not just old money. They're power. They own banks, real estate, media. If they find out what's in those documents before we can secure them and verify everything, they'll come for you. The words sent ice down Audrey's spine. Reginald Harlow already knows I found something. He warned me not to open the wall. Then he's going to know even more very soon. Isaiah stood. I'm assigning a patrol car to watch the house tonight. Don't go anywhere alone. Don't talk to reporters. And if anyone contacts you about selling this property, you call me immediately. After the police left, after the evidence was loaded and the basement was taped off as a crime scene, Audrey sat with Ruth and Lily in the parlor and tried to process what they had uncovered. Not just a body, not just an old mystery, but proof of a conspiracy that had stolen and destroyed lives, that had murdered good men and buried the truth for over a century. Ruth's hands trembled as she poured tea. Your great-great-grandfather was a hero. He was a builder who couldn't save everyone. Audrey's throat was tight. And it got him killed. But he tried. That's more than most people can say. Lily had been quiet since the police left, curled in an armchair with one of the leather journals they'd found in the pantry. Now she looked up, her young face serious beyond her years.
Grandma, if we tell people about this, will the bad families come after us like they came after Jonathan?
Audrey wanted to lie, to offer comfort she didn't feel. But Lily deserved truth. I don't know, sweetheart. But I know that keeping it secret is what they want. And I'm tired of doing what powerful people want just because they're powerful. The patrol car parked across the street provided little comfort when Audrey finally went to bed. She lay awake listening to the building hold its silence like a breath, to the whisper of wind through gaps in the siding, to the absence of knocking from the basement. Jonathan was silent now. The wall was open, the secret exposed, but the weight hadn't lifted. It had simply changed shape, becoming something more immediate and dangerous. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, a text from an unknown number. You should have taken the money. Now you've made this personal. She showed Isaiah in the morning when he returned with Dr. Margot Brennan, an architectural historian from the University of Maine who specialized in hidden structures and resistance networks. Margot was 36, with sharp eyes and an intensity that filled the room as she examined the basement.
This is extraordinary.
Margot ran her hands along the brick, measuring the thickness, noting the ventilation shafts Thomas had built into the ceiling. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was designed for long-term human occupancy. The air system alone would have taken weeks to engineer. She turned to Audrey.
Your great-great-grandfather was brilliant. He was also targeted.
Isaiah showed her the threatening text. Margot's expression hardened. We need to move fast. I can authenticate these documents, cross-reference the names with immigration records and labor contracts from the period. If we can prove the connection between the betrayers list and actual crimes, this becomes national news. Historical reparations, criminal investigations, everything. And if we can't prove it, Audrey asked, then it's just a story about a crazy old house and some questionable accusations against powerful families. Margot met her eyes. Which is why we document everything, right now, before anyone has a chance to make this disappear. They worked through the day, Margot photographing each page of the ledgers, cross-referencing names against records she pulled from university databases. Bridget O'Connor had indeed arrived in Portland in March 1904, listed on immigration manifests. She had disappeared from official records 2 weeks later. Until Margot found a census entry for Bridget Connolly in Boston, 1910, married with 3 children. The name change, the timing, everything matched. Giuseppe Romano, Anna Kowalska, Helena Murphy. One by one, Margot traced the saved souls into new lives, new names, families that had grown and spread across America without ever knowing how close their ancestors had come to being lost. But the 19 names marked intercepted told darker stories. Anna Kowalska's older sister Carolina, age 16, listed as drowned in the harbor, 1902. Patrick Murphy, age 14, died in a factory fire that the record suggested wasn't accidental. Maeve O'Brien, age 14, found dead near the rail yards. By evening, Margot had compiled a preliminary report. 237 documented saves, 19 confirmed deaths of people who had been intercepted, 8 families who had profited from trafficking labor, and 1 architect who had built an entire house as a fortress of evidence, knowing it might be the only witness that survived. The local news got wind of the story that night. A reporter showed up at the house asking for comment, camera crew in tow. Audrey refused to speak, but they filmed the exterior anyway. And by 10 p.m., the story was leading the broadcast. Historic discovery in Portland reveals underground railroad for immigrant laborers. Sealed room contains remains of victim, documents implicating prominent families. Reginald Harlow's face appeared on screen, standing outside his office building, expression carefully neutral. These are serious allegations about events that allegedly occurred over a century ago. My family's legacy speaks for itself. We've built this city, employed thousands, and contributed to the community for generations. I'm confident that any legitimate investigation will reveal the truth. The threat was subtle but clear. Truth as he defined it, investigation as he could control it. Isaiah called at midnight. We have a problem. The city building inspector just issued an emergency condemnation order on your house. Claims it's structurally unsound due to the unauthorized demolition of a load-bearing wall. The wall I broke down wasn't load-bearing. I know that. You know that. But Ted Walsh, who happens to golf with Reginald Harlow every Saturday, signed the order anyway. You have 72 hours to vacate. Audrey felt rage crystallize into something cold and hard. They're trying to force me out before I can fight back. They're trying to bury this before it becomes undeniable. Isaiah's voice carried an edge she hadn't heard before. But here's what they don't know. I've already sent copies of everything to the FBI. Those trafficking operations crossed state lines, federal jurisdiction. And I've got a friend at the Portland Press-Herald who's very interested in why the great-great-grandson of Samuel Harlow is suddenly so concerned about a condemned house. The next 72 hours became a war fought with paperwork and publicity. Audrey hired a structural engineer who confirmed the wall was non-essential. Margot gave interviews to every media outlet that called, explaining the historical significance of the discovery. The story spread from local news to regional coverage to a call from a PBS documentary crew. But Harlow fought back with money and influence. The condemnation order stood, despite appeals. A city council meeting was called to discuss designating Mercy Road as a redevelopment zone, which would allow forced sale through eminent domain. Anonymous editorials appeared in newspapers questioning Audrey's mental stability, suggesting she had fabricated evidence to avoid financial troubles. On the third day, with the deadline to vacate approaching, Audrey received a visitor she hadn't expected. Siobhan O'Brien was 72 years old, elegant despite her years, with eyes that held fierce intelligence. She stood on the porch with a leather folder tucked under her arm and introduced herself without preamble. My grandmother was Bridget O'Connor. She was 19 years old when she arrived in America with nothing but the clothes on her back and a brother's address in Portland. The address turned out to be a labor camp. She was locked in a factory dormitory and told she owed 3 years of work to pay for her passage. She would have died there if someone hadn't helped her escape. Audrey stepped aside to let her in. Siobhan entered and stood in the hallway, looking around as if seeing ghosts. My grandmother spoke about a kind man only once, to my mother, on her deathbed. Said an architect had built her a new life with his own hands. We thought it was delirium. She pulled documents from her folder, but I've spent the last 2 days going through family records. Letters, photographs, a journal my grandmother kept. And I found this. She handed Audrey a photograph, sepia-toned and fragile. It showed a group of 12 people standing before a house Audrey recognized immediately. This house, in 1904, fresh paint gleaming. In the center stood Thomas Callahan, unsmiling but present. Beside him, a young woman with dark eyes and a determined set to her jaw. On the back, in faded ink, the ones who made it, March 1904, T.C. Your grandmother is in this photo? Third from the left, Siobhan pointed to the young woman. She changed her name to Bridget Connolly, married an Irish carpenter in Boston, had 6 children. Worked in a textile factory until she was 70. She died at 86, surrounded by family who exist because a stranger chose to risk everything to help her. Audrey's throat tightened, but she held back emotion. Siobhan wasn't finished. I've contacted the other families, the Romanos, the Kowalskis, the Murphys.
14 descendants have been located so far. We're organizing. We want to help you fight this. You don't have to. Yes, we do. Siobhan's voice was steel wrapped in silk. Those men who trafficked our ancestors, who killed the ones they caught, who murdered Thomas Callahan to protect their profits, their descendants are still profiting from that blood money. The Harlows, the Canes, the Morrisons. They've built empires on our grandparents' suffering. It's time for them to answer for it. Over the following week, the descendants arrived. Lucia Romano from New York, whose great-grandfather Giuseppe had been 14 when he escaped the rail yards. Helena Kowalska, 85 years old, who wept when she saw her grandmother Anna's name in the ledger. James Morrison, whose family had changed their name from Moretti and never knew why. Declan Murphy, who brought photographs of ancestors lost to factory fires that the historical record called accidents. They gathered in the parlor that Audrey and Garrett had cleaned and repaired, sitting on furniture borrowed and salvaged, and they told their stories. How their families had thrived despite obstacles. How they had wondered about gaps in their histories. How they had sensed something unspoken beneath the surface of their American dream. Margot documented everything, building a case that linked past to present, proving that the 237 people Thomas Callahan had saved had become thousands of descendants who deserved to know their own history. But Reginald Harlow escalated. The break-in came on a Tuesday night, 2 weeks after Jonathan Webb's body had been removed and the basement had been returned to Audrey's custody. She woke to the sound of glass shattering, Lily's scream from down the hall, footsteps pounding on the stairs. She grabbed her phone and the baseball bat she'd started keeping beside her bed, ran to Lily's room. The girl was pressed against the wall, eyes wide. Ruth appeared in the doorway, face pale. Downstairs, voices, the crash of furniture. Audrey hit Isaiah's number on speed dial and whispered into the phone. 2 men, breaking in. They're in the basement. Stay where you are.
Lock the door. I'm 3 minutes out. But Lily was crying, and Ruth was shaking, and Audrey felt rage override fear. She stepped into the hallway and shouted down the stairs, "Get out of my house!" The footsteps stopped. Then a male voice, muffled. "We're not here to hurt you. Just give us the boxes and we'll leave. The police are coming." There was a pause, then the sound of things being thrown, papers scattering. Audrey realized with sick certainty that they weren't trying to steal the boxes. They already knew the police had the originals. They were destroying what was left, the journals and blueprints and anything else that might corroborate the evidence. She started down the stairs, bat raised, and nearly collided with a man coming up. He wore a ski mask and gloves and carried a crowbar. When he saw her, he shoved hard. Audrey stumbled backward, cracking her head against the wall. Pain exploded white and hot. Lily screamed, and there were sirens in the distance getting closer. The man ran past her, his partner following, and they were gone through the front door before Audrey could get her vision to clear. Ruth helped her sit up, pressing a towel to the cut on her head. Blood soaked through immediately. Isaiah arrived with 3 patrol cars, EMTs right behind. They checked Audrey's pupils, bandaged her head, recommended the hospital, but she refused. The house was chaos. Furniture overturned, journals scattered, photographs torn. But in the basement, Lily's phone had been live streaming to the cloud from where she'd hidden it at the top of the stairs. The video showed everything. 2 masked men searching frantically, one of them pulling tin boxes from a cupboard where Audrey had stored Thomas's personal effects. The audio caught fragments of conversation. "Harlow's going to kill us if we don't find the backup copies. Just grab everything and burn it." Then Audrey's voice shouting, the scramble up the stairs, the shove that sent her sprawling.
The clear view of the crowbar, the glove with a monogram visible for just 3 frames, but enough. H. D.C. Harlow Development Corporation. Isaiah's face was stone as he watched. That's assault, breaking and entering, conspiracy to destroy evidence. He looked at Audrey. I'm arresting Reginald Harlow tonight. The arrest made national news.
The son of one of Portland's wealthiest families, CEO of a development empire, taken from his office in handcuffs and charged with conspiracy, witness intimidation, and felony assault. His lawyer immediately posted bail, $100,000, paid within hours. But the damage was done. The press conference that followed was brutal. Reginald stood outside the courthouse, flanked by attorneys, and denied everything. I had no knowledge of any break-in. If employees of my company were involved, they acted without my authority. This is a politically motivated prosecution designed to tarnish my family's reputation. But one of the two men arrested with the monogrammed glove had already started talking. Eric Vance, 34, with a record of minor offenses and no loyalty to employers who threw him under the bus. He told investigators that Reginald Harlow had personally hired him to retrieve documents from the Mercy Roadhouse, had paid $10,000 up front, with another $10,000 promised on completion. Had specifically instructed them to make sure the woman understands this is her last warning. The DA filed additional charges. The story exploded across regional media and began creeping toward national attention. A local reporter dug into Harlow family history and found connections between Samuel Harlow's business dealings in 1906 and the labor camps Thomas Callahan's network had been fighting. Bank records showing payments to immigration officials. Property deeds for buildings that had housed trafficked workers. A pattern that stretched from past to present. Blood money compounding across generations. And through it all, Audrey continued the work. With Margot's help, she cataloged every document, every photograph, every scrap of evidence. Ruth and Lily helped organize, creating a timeline that mapped Thomas Callahan's 5-year fight against a system that treated human beings as cargo. The descendants kept coming. By the end of April, 47 families had been located, each one carrying DNA that traced back to the 237 names in the ledger. They brought stories, documents, proof of lives that had flourished because one man had refused to look away from suffering. They also brought money. Small donations at first. $20 here, $50 there. Then larger amounts as word spread. A GoFundMe page that Margot set up raised $18,000 in a week. Enough to hire lawyers to fight the condemnation order. Enough to begin real repairs on the house. Enough to make Audrey believe that maybe, possibly, she could transform this place into something Thomas Callahan would recognize. A house built not for hiding, but for remembrance. The trial came faster than expected, scheduled for mid-June. Reginald Harlow's lawyers tried every delay tactic, but the prosecution had video evidence, a cooperating witness, and a judge who was done with wealthy defendants using the legal system as a shield. Audrey attended every day of proceedings, sitting in the gallery with Isaiah, Margot, and a rotating group of descendants. She watched Reginald's carefully constructed denials crumble under cross-examination, watched Eric Vance testify about the phone calls, the cash payments, the explicit instructions to scare the Callahan woman into selling. The defense argued circumstantial evidence, lack of direct proof, the desperation of a man trying to frame his betters. But the jury saw through it. They saw a pattern of harassment that had escalated to violence. They saw a powerful man who thought his money made him untouchable. The verdict came on a humid afternoon in late June. Guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing 2 weeks later drew crowds. The courtroom was packed with descendants, reporters, and citizens who had followed the case. The judge was a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen too much injustice to tolerate more. She sentenced Reginald Harlow to 15 months in prison, $50,000 in fines, and a restraining order preventing him from coming within 500 feet of Audrey Callahan or the Mercy Road property. She also ordered his company to pay restitution to the Descendants Fund that had been established to preserve Thomas Callahan's legacy. As Reginald was led away, his face a mask of barely controlled rage, he looked directly at Audrey and mouthed two words. "This isn't over." Isaiah touched her shoulder. "Yes, it is." But even as the criminal case concluded, the historical investigation continued. Margot's cross-referencing had revealed something that made her call Audrey at midnight, voice shaking with excitement. "I found the tunnel." "What tunnel?" "The emergency exit Thomas mentioned in his notes. It doesn't lead to the street. It leads to the house next door. To Garrett Sullivan's house." The next morning, Audrey and Margot stood in Garrett's basement while the old man looked at them with an expression of profound relief mixed with something that might have been shame. "I've known for 60 years. My father showed me when I turned 18, made me promise never to tell anyone unless a Callahan came back and earned the right to know. He led them to a corner that appeared to be solid foundation, then pressed a sequence of stones in a pattern only someone who knew would recognize. A section of wall swung inward, revealing a passage barely 3 feet wide, lined with brick and smelling of earth and time. They followed it by flashlight, Audrey's heart pounding. The tunnel ran 40 meters, sloping slightly downward before rising again. At the end, another hidden door opened into the basement of the Mercy Road house, concealed behind what Audrey had assumed was just another support wall. "Thomas built a network," Garrett said quietly. "My great-grandfather's house was stationed too. There were 12 in total, all along the coast. Secret routes, hidden passages, rooms that could shelter people for days or weeks while they waited for safe transport north." Margot was documenting everything with her camera, emotion thick in her voice. "This is the most sophisticated resistance architecture I've ever seen." Thomas Callahan wasn't just saving people. He was building a shadow infrastructure that could have changed everything if it hadn't been discovered. "What happened?" Audrey asked. "How did they find out?" Garrett's expression darkened. "According to my father, someone inside the network betrayed them, sold the information to Samuel Harlow and the others for money. They raided the safe houses, arrested or killed everyone they could find. Thomas managed to get Jonathan Webb into the sealed room with the evidence before they came for him. Then he went to lead them away, thinking he could buy time for help to arrive. But they killed him instead. At the harbor. Made it look like an accident." Garrett's voice was heavy with decades of carried guilt. "My father helped seal that wall. He was 16 years old, and Thomas Callahan was dying. And the last thing Thomas told him was that the truth had to survive, even if the people didn't. So my father sealed Jonathan inside with all the evidence, knowing Jonathan would die, because Thomas believed someday someone would be brave enough to open it." They stood in the tunnel, in the cold darkness between two houses that had held secrets for over a century. Audrey thought about Jonathan Webb waiting in the dark, about Thomas Callahan bleeding out by the harbor, about all the desperate trust required to believe that truth mattered enough to die for. "We need to excavate the other safe houses," Margot said. "Document the entire network. This isn't just Portland history. This is American history that's been deliberately erased." The work consumed the next 2 months. Ground-penetrating radar located the remains of 4 other houses that had been demolished decades ago. Archaeologists found tunnels, hidden rooms, artifacts that proved the network had been real and extensive. Each discovery brought new descendants forward, new stories, new proof. By September, Audrey's house had been transformed. The condemnation order had been overturned after 3 structural engineers confirmed it was sound. With money from the Descendants Fund and a matching grant from the National Park Service, they restored the first floor to period accuracy while modernizing the infrastructure. The basement became a climate-controlled archive, the sealed room preserved behind glass as a memorial. The grand opening was scheduled for September 10th, exactly 175 days after Audrey had first entered the house. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. 5 days before the 6-month requirement for ownership, as if the house itself had been waiting to see if she would prove worthy. 300 people attended: descendants, historians, city officials, and journalists from outlets across the country. Isaiah gave a speech about his great-great-grandfather Jonathan Webb, about closure that had taken 4 generations to achieve. Margot presented her research documenting the network's scope and impact. Helena Kowalski, now 85 years old, read a letter Thomas Callahan had written to her grandmother, Anna, preserved in one of the tin boxes. Dear Anna, you are safe now. The bad men cannot find you here. When you grow up, I hope you remember that America is built by people like you, the ones brave enough to start over. Grow strong, little one. Build something beautiful. Yours in hope, T.C. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Audrey stood before the crowd in the house that had become hers through inheritance and choice, and spoke about what it meant to carry someone else's courage forward, about how Thomas Callahan had built walls not to divide, but to protect, had created darkness so that truth could survive to see light. This house is yours now, all of you whose ancestors were saved, all of you whose families were built on their second chances. This is your history, your heritage. We're calling it the Callahan Safe House Museum, and it will stand as long as memory matters. The applause was thunderous. But that night, after the crowds had gone and Ruth and Lily had fallen asleep upstairs, Audrey descended to the basement alone. She stood before the glass that now enclosed Jonathan Webb's memorial room and placed her hand against it. We found you. We told your story. You can rest now. The building held its silence like a breath, and for just a moment, Audrey could have sworn she felt warmth against her palm, a presence that had waited over a century to be acknowledged. Then it was gone, and she was alone with the evidence and the names and the weight of truth finally spoken aloud. Outside, the September moon rose over Mercy Road, casting silver light through windows that had been dark for too long. The house that had kept secrets was keeping them no longer. Every name on the memorial wall was a voice reclaimed from silence. Every descendant who walked through the doors was proof that cruelty doesn't have the final word. Audrey climbed the stairs to her bedroom, exhausted and satisfied. Tomorrow she would sign the final ownership papers. Tomorrow the house would legally belong to her, and she would immediately transfer it to the trust that would preserve it forever. But tonight, she was simply the woman who had answered when the house called, who had listened when the walls whispered, who had broken through brick and a century of deliberate forgetting to find the truth waiting on the other side. She lay down in the dark and closed her eyes, thinking about Thomas Callahan building this place with his own hands, brick by brick, room by room, secret by secret. Thinking about Jonathan Webb trusting that someone would come, thinking about all the desperate hope required to believe that justice delayed is not justice denied, only justice waiting for someone brave enough to demand it. The house breathed around her, alive with memory, but not yet at peace. The story was not finished. There was one more room waiting to be found. The call came at dawn on September 16th, the day the 6-month deadline officially passed and the house became irrevocably hers. Audrey woke to her phone vibrating across the nightstand, Garrett's name glowing on the screen. "You need to come to my house. Now. Bring Margot if you can reach her." She found him in his basement, standing before the tunnel entrance with a crowbar in one hand and a flashlight in the other. Behind him, a section of brick that should have been solid foundation had been pried away, revealing a cavity in the wall. "I couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about what my father said before he died. That Thomas hid something bigger than the documents. Something that would change everything if it was ever found." Audrey stepped closer, her pulse quickening. "What did you find?" "Not what. Where?" Garrett aimed his flashlight into the cavity. "There's another chamber. Not in your house. In mine. Built into the foundation in 1906, right before Thomas died. My father said it was Thomas's insurance. Proof so damning that even destroying the safe houses wouldn't make it disappear." Margot arrived 20 minutes later, camera already recording. Together they widened the opening until it was large enough to crawl through. The space beyond was smaller than Jonathan Webb's sealed room, perhaps 8 feet by 10, with a ceiling so low Audrey had to duck. But what it lacked in size, it made up for in contents. 19 wooden coffins lined the walls, each one small enough to hold a child. Margot's camera trembled in her hands. Oh my God. They weren't empty. Careful excavation over the next 6 hours revealed skeletal remains in each one, preserved by the sealed environment. Children and young adults, the medical examiner would later confirm, aged 8 to 22. Each coffin had a name carved into its lid. Karolina Kowalska, Patrick Murphy, Maeve O'Brien. Names Audrey recognized from the ledger, the 19 marked intercepted. "These are the ones they caught," Margot whispered. "The ones Thomas couldn't save. But why bury them here?" Audrey stood among the coffins, fighting nausea and rage in equal measure. Why hide their bodies? Garrett picked up a leather folder that had been tucked beside the first coffin. Because he documented how each one died. Murder disguised as accidents, drownings that were actually beatings, factory fires deliberately set to eliminate witnesses. And he knew the men who did it, because some of those men used his network to identify their targets. The folder contained death certificates, official documents signed by a coroner named Dr. Atticus Brennan, declaring causes of death that the attached autopsy notes proved were lies. Karolina Kowalska, drowned in harbor accident. Brennan's hidden notes, victim was dead before fire started. 19 certificates, 19 sets of contradictory notes, and beneath them all, a single sheet in Thomas Callahan's handwriting. Dr. Brennan gave me these at great personal risk. He was threatened by the same men who killed these children. He forged the official reports to protect his own family, but he could not live with the lie. These bodies were recovered from the harbor, from construction sites, from places where they were dumped and forgotten. I have given them names and dignity in death. I have recorded how they were stolen from families who will never know what happened to them. And I have hidden this evidence where it will survive, even if I do not. So that someday, someone can speak for those who have no voice left to speak with. Below that, dated April 14th, 1906, one day before Thomas died, a final addendum. They are coming for me tomorrow. I will not survive, but I have built this house on their graves, and every footstep taken here will tread on the memory of their stolen lives. May whoever finds this have the courage I lacked to make the world answer for what was done. Audrey sat on the cold concrete floor, overwhelmed by the weight of what Thomas Callahan had carried in secret, what he had built into his own home's foundation and then died before he could tell anyone it existed.
Margot was on the phone with Isaiah, her voice shaking as she described what they'd found.
Within an hour, the basement was a crime scene again, this time not for a murder 120 years old, but for 19. The medical examiner's preliminary report confirmed what the hidden autopsy notes suggested. Violent deaths, all of them. Several showed evidence of prolonged abuse before death.
The DNA extraction would take weeks, but Margot had already begun cross-referencing the names against the families who had come forward.
Helena Kowalski had mentioned a sister who vanished. Siobhan O'Brien had a great-aunt whose fate was never known. Now they would know. Isaiah stood among the coffins, his face carved from stone. This isn't just historical. This is evidence of organized murder for profit.
If we can link these deaths directly to Samuel Harlow and the others on the betrayers list, their descendants don't just face historical condemnation. They face civil liability, wrongful death suits, demands for reparations. The Harlow family will fight this, Margot said. Let them. Isaiah's voice was cold. My great-great-grandfather died alone in the dark waiting for rescue. These children died violently and were thrown away like garbage. I don't care how much money or power their killers' families have. They're going to answer for it. The news broke that evening, carefully controlled through a press conference where Isaiah, Margot, and Audrey stood together and explained what had been found. The response was immediate and overwhelming. National media descended on Portland. The story dominated cable news cycles. Congressional representatives called for federal investigation into historical labor trafficking networks. But the real impact came from the descendants. Helena Kowalska arrived at the house the next morning, 85 years old and moving slowly, supported by her daughter. She stood before the coffin marked Karolina Kowalska and placed her hand on the wood. My grandmother spoke about her sister Karolina for 60 years, said she was smart and fierce and only 16 when she disappeared. The family was told she ran away with a boy, brought shame to the family name. My grandmother carried that shame her whole life, thinking her sister had abandoned them. She turned to Audrey, tears streaming down her weathered face. You've given us the truth. After all these years, we know she didn't abandon us. She was stolen, murdered, and the men who did it made sure we'd never know, so we'd blame her instead of them. That same day, Siobhan O'Brien brought a photograph she'd found in her mother's belongings. Maeve O'Brien at age 14, dark-haired and smiling, standing beside her sister Bridget before they left Ireland. Siobhan placed it beside the coffin bearing Maeve's name. Bridget never stopped looking for her, never stopped hoping she'd made it to America somehow, that they'd find each other again. She died at 86, still wondering. The families organized a memorial service for the 19th, multi-faith, led by a rabbi, a priest, and a Buddhist monk who volunteered their time. They gathered in Garrett's basement, now cleaned and transformed into a temporary chapel. Each coffin was draped with white cloth. Candles burned in 19 holders arranged in a circle. Audrey stood among them and listened as descendants spoke about ancestors they'd never met, but whose loss had shaped their family histories. Stories of grandmothers who flinched at loud noises, grandfathers who never spoke about the old country. The inherited trauma of knowing someone was missing, but not knowing why. When it came time for Audrey to speak, she almost couldn't. The weight of what Thomas Callahan had done, recovering 19 bodies, giving them dignity, preserving evidence of their murders while knowing it might not be found in his lifetime, felt impossible to articulate. But Lily was watching from beside Ruth, her young face serious and expectant. Audrey thought about the courage children carried when adults trusted them with truth. Thomas Callahan built this house knowing he would die for what he believed.
He saved 237 people and failed to save 19 more. But he refused to let those 19 disappear. He made their deaths matter by making sure they'd eventually be found. Her voice steadied. We stand here because one man chose to remember when everyone else chose to forget.
Because he built memory into brick and mortar and his own foundation. Because he understood that walls cannot hold truth forever. Truth buried is not truth destroyed. It's truth waiting. The families wept together. Strangers bound by loss, separated by more than a century, but united in this moment of acknowledgement. Afterward, Isaiah pulled Audrey aside. We traced the ownership of the buildings where these bodies were originally found. Factory sites, warehouses, a textile mill, all owned or operated by companies controlled by the 8 families on the betrayers list. Can you prove they knew? We can prove the deaths were covered up. We can prove the companies benefited from trafficking labor. We can prove the same families accumulated massive wealth in the decade after Thomas died. His expression hardened. The FBI is opening a formal investigation into historical RICO violations. If we can establish a continuing criminal enterprise, profits from 19th century crimes funding 20th century business, the statute of limitations doesn't apply. You're going after their money. I'm going after justice. The families of these victims deserve restitution, and the families who've built empires on blood money need to answer for it. Over the next month, the investigation expanded beyond anything Audrey had imagined. Federal prosecutors subpoenaed records from Harlow Development Corporation, Kane Financial Services, Morrison Real Estate Holdings, and 5 other companies linked to the betrayers' descendants. Forensic accountants traced money flows backward through a century of transactions, finding patterns that suggested systematic profit from exploitation. The Harlow family hired a team of lawyers who immediately filed motions to suppress evidence, claiming the documents found in the sealed room were not authenticated, that the bodies could not be definitively linked to their ancestors' businesses, that the whole investigation was a politically motivated attack on successful families. But then, Margot found something that shattered their defense. She was examining Thomas Callahan's personal effects, documents that had survived in a fireproof box in the cornerstone, when she discovered a letter dated April 10th, 1906. It was from Samuel Harlow to Thomas, hand-delivered based on the lack of postal markings. Callahan, you were warned. You chose the wrong side. Those people are cargo, not humans. I did what I had to do to protect my business interests. If you expose me, I will kill everyone you love. Consider this your final opportunity to walk away. Sell your house, leave Portland, and I will ensure your family's safety. Refuse, and you will watch them die before you do. S. H. Attached to it was Thomas's response, never sent. Harlow, I've hidden proof that will outlive both of us. You can murder the messenger, but the message will survive. One day someone will find it, and your name will be remembered for the evil you've done. I will not walk away. I will not be silent, and I will not let you destroy any more lives. T.C. The confession in Samuel Harlow's own handwriting, acknowledging the trafficking, threatening murder, was devastating. Combined with the autopsy evidence and financial records, it built a case that was impossible to dismiss as historical speculation. The Harlow family's legal strategy collapsed. Robert Harlow, Reginald's 82-year-old father and CEO emeritus of the family empire, held a press conference where he stood stone-faced beside his attorneys and read a prepared statement denying knowledge of his great-great-grandfather's crimes while expressing regret for any suffering that may have occurred. But his daughter Victoria broke ranks. She was 50 years old, a corporate attorney who had spent 30 years building the Harlow business into a multi-state operation. She appeared on national television without consulting her family first and did what her father would not. I'm ashamed. My family built our wealth on stolen lives, on children who were murdered to protect profit margins, on immigrants who were treated as disposable. I cannot defend that. I will not defend that. She announced she was donating $1 million to the Callahan Safe House Museum and the Descendants Fund. She legally changed her name to Victoria Callahan Harlow in solidarity with the victims. And she broke from the family business entirely, resigning from all corporate positions. The gesture split the Harlow family publicly. Robert disowned her in a statement dripping with bitterness. Reginald, released from prison after serving 14 months on his 15-month sentence for good behavior, refused to comment. But Victoria's choice inspired others. A Morrison descendant came forward with family records showing his great-grandfather's guilt and committing to restitution. A Blackwell heir established a scholarship fund for descendants of trafficking victims. Not all the families responded. Some circled wagons, hired more lawyers, fought harder, but enough broke that the wall of denial crumbled. The Department of Justice announced a settlement in late October. The 8 families collectively agreed to pay $89 million in reparations to be distributed among verified descendants and used to fund historical preservation and education initiatives. It was the largest historical reparations settlement in American history. Audrey watched the announcement on television with Ruth, Lily, Garrett, Margot, and Isaiah crowded into the parlor that had been transformed from decay to dignity. When the number flashed on screen, Lily turned to her grandmother with wide eyes. "Does this mean we're rich?" "No, sweetheart. This means the people whose ancestors were stolen and killed will finally receive something the world told them they'd never get. Acknowledgement that what happened to them was wrong and that it matters." The museum officially opened to the public on November 1st, exactly 7 months after Audrey had first entered the house. The transformation was complete. The first floor had been restored to period accuracy, with exhibits documenting Thomas Callahan's network. The basement archives held temperature-controlled storage for the original documents. The sealed room where Jonathan Webb had died was preserved behind glass, a memorial to sacrifice and trust betrayed. And in Garrett's basement, now connected to the museum via the restored tunnel, the 19 coffins rested in a dedicated memorial space, each one accompanied by a photograph of the victim, if available, a description of who they were, and a stark accounting of how they died. The space was somber, reverent, a place where silence spoke louder than words. But it was the memorial wall that stopped visitors cold. A floor-to-ceiling installation listing 256 names. 237 saved by Thomas Callahan's network. 19 who were intercepted and killed. Each name carved into polished granite. Each one a testament to lives that mattered, despite attempts to erase them. The first month brought 5,000 visitors. Students on field trips, historians doing research, descendants traveling from across the country to see proof of their ancestors' courage. And slowly, inevitably, tourists who came because the story had captured national attention and they wanted to witness history made visible. Audrey moved through the space with a mixture of pride and purpose. She had been named director of the museum with a salary of $45,000, enough to support herself, Ruth, and contribute to Lily's care. The ownership had been transferred to a trust governed by 7 descendants, ensuring no single family could control the narrative. Ruth had recovered in the months since they'd arrived, her heart condition stabilizing with proper medication and the peace that came from no longer worrying about money or eviction.
She tended the garden that now flourished in the backyard, planting flowers representing the 19 lost souls. Marigolds for Maeve O'Brien, violets for Anna Kowalska, chrysanthemums for each name. Lily gave tours on Saturdays, her young voice explaining the hidden passages and the underground network with enthusiasm that never seemed to fade. She had announced her intention to study architecture when she grew up, to learn how to build things that would last, like her great-great-great-grandfather had. On a cold afternoon in mid-November, Audrey was cataloging new donations when Garrett found her in the archive room. "There's something I need to show you. Something my father made me promise to keep until the museum was open, and you'd proven you were staying." He led her to his workshop and retrieved a leather journal from a locked drawer. Inside, his father's handwriting filled page after page with testimony. "My name is Declan Sullivan. I am 73 years old, and I am writing this in 1979 because I can no longer carry these memories alone. I was 16 when I helped Thomas Callahan build the sealed room. I was there the night he brought Jonathan Webb into it, surrounded by evidence that could destroy 8 of Portland's most powerful men. I sealed that wall, knowing Jonathan would die inside it, and I have carried that weight for 73 years. Audrey read carefully, absorbing details that filled gaps in the story. How Thomas had discovered the trafficking network by accident when a young woman named Bridget showed up at his door, half dead from abuse, begging for help. How he had been unable to turn her away. How one rescue had led to another until he found himself running an underground railroad he'd never planned to build. How the network had been betrayed by someone inside it, a man named Patrick Fletcher who had been bribed by Samuel Harlow to provide names and locations. How Fletcher's betrayal had led to the deaths of the 19 and the destruction of half the safe houses before Thomas even knew what was happening. How Thomas had made the decision to seal Jonathan Webb in the east wall with all the evidence, because federal marshals were coming from Boston but wouldn't arrive for 5 days, and the betrayers were coming that night. How he'd promised Jonathan it was temporary, just until the danger passed, that he'd be back within 24 hours. And how Thomas had gone to confront Samuel Harlow at the harbor, not to fight, but to surrender himself in exchange for stopping the raids on the remaining safe houses. How Harlow had agreed, then killed him anyway, making it look accidental, ensuring the network's evidence died with its architect. Declan Sullivan's final entry was dated 2 weeks before his death. "I am dying with this knowledge, and I am terrified it will die with me. I have told my son Garrett where the evidence is hidden, but I am not sure he believes me. I am not sure anyone will believe me, but I need to say this clearly before I go. Thomas Callahan was a hero. Jonathan Webb was a hero. The 237 people they saved went on to build families and lives and futures because of them. And the 19 who were killed deserved better than to be forgotten. If anyone reads this someday, please remember them all. Please make their deaths mean something. Please don't let the people who killed them win by erasing them from history." Audrey closed the journal, her hands unsteady. "How long have you had this?" 45 years. Garrett's voice was rough. "My father died 3 days after finishing it. I read it once, couldn't process what it meant, and locked it away. When you showed up and started opening walls, I knew. I knew this was what he'd been waiting for." She looked at the old man who had watched this house for decades, who had kept faith with a promise made to his dying father. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I needed to see if you'd stay. If you'd fight when it got hard. If you were worthy of what my father and your great-great-grandfather died protecting." Garrett met her eyes. "You proved you were. You're still here. The truth is told. The dead are honored. That's all any of them wanted." That evening,
Audrey sat alone in Jonathan Webb's memorial room, separated from the space where he died by a pane of glass. The room had been left exactly as they'd found it. The table, the collapsed chair, the tin boxes now replaced with museum-quality replicas. Only Jonathan's remains had been removed, buried in a plot beside his wife Mary after DNA testing confirmed his identity. She thought about the letter Thomas had written, the promise that hadn't been kept, the trust that had been violated by circumstance rather than choice. Jonathan had waited 6 days in darkness, believing help was coming. Had he known Thomas was already dead? Had he died still hoping? Or had he died understanding he'd been forgotten? The museum had commissioned a plaque that now hung on the wall beside the glass. It quoted Jonathan's final words from his journal, the last thing he'd written before he became too weak to hold a pen. Tell Mary I loved her. Tell Thomas I forgive him. Forgiveness for being human. For failing despite best intentions. For building hope and having it collapse under the weight of evil better organized and more ruthless than goodness could predict. Audrey pressed her palm against the glass. We told them. Everyone knows now. You didn't die for nothing. The glass was cold beneath her hand. Just glass. No warmth or presence or ghostly confirmation. Just the quiet of a room that had kept its secrets until someone was brave enough to demand them. She climbed the stairs to the main floor where Ruth was making tea and Lily was doing homework at the kitchen table. Normal domestic sounds in a house that had been anything but normal. The museum closed at 6, but their living quarters on the second floor remained theirs. A family that had stumbled into history and chosen to stay. Garrett knocked on the door just as they were sitting down to dinner, carrying a casserole and news. The city council voted. They're designating Mercy Road as a historic preservation zone. No development allowed. No eminent domain. The house and the surrounding properties are protected indefinitely. Audrey felt the last knot of tension release from her shoulders. It's really over. The fight to keep it. The fight to keep it is over. Garrett set down the casserole and smiled. The fight to make it matter is just beginning. Over the following weeks, letters arrived from across the country. Descendants thanking Audrey for giving them their history. Students asking questions for research projects. Historians requesting access to the archives. And a surprising number of people who had no connection to the story, but felt compelled to write anyway, sharing their own experiences of loss, injustice, and the fierce human need to be remembered. One letter came from a 90-year-old woman in Boston whose grandmother had known Jonathan Webb. She enclosed a photograph Audrey had never seen, Jonathan and Mary's wedding, 1905, both of them young and hopeful and unaware of how soon tragedy would find them. On the back, in faded ink, may we build a life worthy of the dreams we carry. Audrey added it to the museum collection and ordered a copy for the memorial room. December brought the first snow, transforming Mercy Road into something from an old postcard. The museum's second month saw attendance steady at 4,000 visitors, enough to sustain operations with the help of grants and donations. The Descendants Scholarship Fund accepted its first applications, 50 students seeking support for college, all of them able to trace ancestry to names in Thomas Callahan's ledger. On a quiet afternoon when the museum was closed for cleaning, Audrey stood in the parlor and looked around at what they'd built. Not just a museum, but a living memorial. Not just preservation, but ongoing education. Schools brought classes to learn about immigration, labor rights, and the moral courage required to help strangers at great personal cost. Victoria Callahan Harlow visited in mid-December, the first member of her family to step inside. She moved through the exhibits quietly, reading every placard, studying every photograph.
In the basement memorial, she stood before the 19 coffins for nearly an hour. When she emerged, her eyes were red, but her voice was steady.
My children needed to see this, to understand what their legacy actually is. Not the buildings and the money and the social status, the blood underneath all of it. Will you bring them? Victoria nodded. And I'll make sure they understand that wealth built on suffering is not wealth to be proud of. That the only inheritance worth keeping is the one earned through integrity. She donated an additional $200,000. Her own savings, she clarified, not family money, before leaving, earmarked specifically for educational programming. The Christmas season brought unexpected warmth to the house. Ruth, Lily, and Audrey decorated with restraint, not wanting to overshadow the museum's purpose but needing to mark that they lived here, that this was home as well as memorial. Garrett joined them for Christmas dinner, bringing stories about his father and grandfather that added texture to the history they'd uncovered. On New Year's Eve, Isaiah visited with news. The FBI investigation concluded. They've confirmed systematic trafficking operations run by the 8 families from 1890 through 1912. Conservative estimates put the number of victims at over 10,000 people along the eastern seaboard. Only 237 made it through Thomas's network, Audrey said quietly. 237 who had children, who had grandchildren, who became thousands. Isaiah's expression was complicated. We can't save everyone, but we can make sure the ones we couldn't save aren't forgotten. That's what you've done here. That's what matters. As midnight approached and the new year prepared to arrive, Audrey stood on the porch looking out at Mercy Road. Snow fell softly, covering everything in white, making the world clean and quiet. Behind her, warmth and light spilled from windows that had been dark for 30 years. Inside, Ruth and Lily and Garrett were laughing about something, voices carrying through the cold air. She thought about the woman she'd been in March, desperate, alone, one eviction notice away from sleeping in her car. That woman had inherited a house she didn't want and discovered a history she never asked for, had made choices based on stubbornness and spite, and the simple inability to surrender even when surrender seemed wise. That woman was still here, still broke by most measures, still dealing with debt and an ex-husband's lawyers and a life that would never be easy. But she was also the director of a museum that mattered, the keeper of stories that had survived a century to be told. The person Thomas Callahan had been waiting for, even if he never knew her name. The new year arrived with distant fireworks and church bells ringing across Portland. Audrey stayed on the porch, breathing cold air, feeling the house settle into another night of standing watch. Inside her pocket, the key to the basement memorial rested heavy and familiar. She carried it everywhere now, a reminder that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. Nor should they be. The ghosts were quiet now. The knocking had stopped the night the wall came down, as if Jonathan Webb had finally been heard and could rest. But Audrey knew the house still held presences, not spirits, but memories so strong they'd soaked into the wood and brick and foundation. Every footstep taken here was a step on consecrated ground, hallowed not by religion, but by sacrifice. She went inside and locked the door, checked the furnace, turned off the museum lights. Ruth and Lily had gone to bed. Garrett had walked home through the snow, his house visible through the trees, lights burning in windows that connected to hers via tunnel and trust, and a century of kept promises. In her bedroom, Audrey sat at the small desk where she'd been writing her own account of everything that had happened. Not for publication, but for preservation, ensuring that if someday, decades or centuries from now, someone wondered how the museum came to exist, they'd know. They'd understand it wasn't inevitable or easy.
that it required a 52-year-old woman with nothing left to lose, making a choice to stay when leaving would have been simpler. She wrote the final entry by lamplight, her handwriting cramped but legible. We are not heroes. We are simply people who refuse to let truth die when powerful people wanted it buried. Thomas Callahan built this house to save lives. I reopened it to honor them.
May whoever comes after us continue the work of remembering. Because memory without action is just a tomb. But memory that demands justice, that refuses to let suffering be forgotten or dismissed, that builds monuments to the discarded and the destroyed, that kind of memory changes the world. She signed her name, dated it January 1st, 2026, and placed the journal in the fireproof safe where it would wait for whoever needed it next. Then she went to bed in the house that had chosen her, in the room where Harold Callahan had died alone, in a building that had transformed from burden to purpose to home. Outside, snow continued to fall on Mercy Road, covering the sign that marked the museum, the memorial plaques in the garden, the cobblestones where Thomas Callahan had once walked planning networks and schemes and acts of desperate mercy. Morning would bring visitors, questions, the ongoing work of education and preservation. But tonight the house rested. The dead were honored, the living remembered. And somewhere in the space between what was lost and what was saved, justice, delayed by 120 years but never denied, had finally been served. She had been that someone. And the house, patient and stubborn and filled with secrets it refused to surrender easily, had been worth every moment of the fight.